Leah Markey, my colleague from the Center for Renaissance Studies, who uh, is a are you still a current dancer? Do you dance like I play trombone? Um, but she has a very strong interest in dance, and she's agreed to be the moderator for this section. All right, we start with Seth Stewart Williams, who is an assistant professor of dance and medieval Renaissance studies at Barnard College of Columbia University. He received his doctorate in English literature from Columbia University, and his current book project, Choreographic Thinking in Early Modern English Literature, has been supported by a fellowship from the NYU Center for Ballet and Arts and by a long-term fellowship from the Folger Shakespeare Library. Before academia, Williams was a dancer, performing for several years with the companies of Sean Curran, Donald McHale, and Mark Morris, among others. And the title of his talk is Choreography as Chorography in Early Modern England. Seth?
Hello. Let me know if I become inaudible somehow. I'd like to start with a really short embodied activity. I would like you to turn to a person seated next to you, perhaps someone you don't know well, or perhaps someone you do. And if you'd like, I invite you to stand, but if your preference or ability suggests seating, that's great too. All I would like you to do, one person, please take 30 seconds, and all I want you to do is describe how you got here today to them. That's all, that's the assignment, 30 seconds. Don't start with when you first opened your eyes this morning, just describe your commute here. I'm going to leave that as suggestive framing for what I'm going to talk about. I'll leave you to draw some connections if you like. So first, my thanks to Jim and to Emily and to Salma for everything, and Harmony and Kate. I adore your work, so it's great to be sharing time with you. I'm going to talk today about the sort of literary cartographic genre known as chorography, which was, as the OED says, greatly in vogue in the 17th century. And the way in which it was, in many ways, an embodied literary genre. I'm also going to be thinking about the ways in which choreography has a kind of choreographic function to it. I'm going to be looking in particular at the emergence of the genre known as country dancing, and how it cultivated a form of embodied regional geographic awareness. I'll give two brief examples of this, chiefly to do with the county of Herefordshire. I think we're hearing about eels tomorrow, so get ready to hear about sheep today. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about Sanakomoko, or what colonizers called the colony of Virginia. To just sort of flip the title of the symposium a little bit, I think I'm talking today a little bit more about performance as a form of mapping. Let's have a look. So what was chorography? Well, just to rush through a few definitions for those of you who may not be familiar with this literary genre, it describes or maps, and I think that's an interesting pair of terms according to the OED, describes or maps the places, myths, persons, customs, and industries of a region. Thus it is, as Richard Helgerson said in a classic study of the genre, a repository for proper names. Chorography subordinates time to space, to landscape. It has the feel of the present in its use of tense. Its organizing principle, to use a term from narratology, is achronism. In other words, chorographies don't kind of tell a story from start to finish. Their organizing principle is often geographic. It moves from place to place. That's how it's organized as a thing. Most importantly, choreography gives meaning to the landscape it describes. They're very often authored and funded collectively. And this is a real departure from some other print systems in early modernity. And then, fascinatingly, it establishes a dialectic between region, especially at the level of county, and nation. So as you can see in a classic example, William Camden's Britannia, the title page has a picture of the nation, and it's filled with all these county maps like those that Saxton produced. Here's an example of another famous choreographic poem, Polyalbion, often called a topographical poem. Polyalbion is organized in a notably achronistic way. It follows the rivers, for example, the Severn here, and kind of stops at different sites of note along the way. That's how the poem progresses. It follows the logic of a river. Progressing along, in this case, we're looking at Herefordshire, and this follows the Severn River down different cities. We'll be returning to this image to talk about it. And then in Richard Helgerson's classic study of choreography, Forms of Nationhood, he talks about the way in which this genre locates national identity in land at the expense of dynastic loyalty. The monarch is now the land, as he says. Something that plays out, an example he gives is, as we move from Saxton to Hull or Hawley, notice that the Saxton maps have this royal insignia, right? Ties the idea of nation to the kind of imprimatur of the monarch. Whereas by the time we get to Polyalbion, there's no sign of the monarch anywhere on this. Although if we zoom in, as we will shortly, you'll see that all of these kind of personifications of the landscape are all wearing little crowns, right? The monarch actually becomes the land. Helgerson also talks about how the project of choreography is also reforming European vernaculars to English ends, and talks about the way in which this plays out in the design of maps, and in the way that choreography often tries to invent English ways of doing continental forms of verse. He poses a question then in talking about Polyalbion especially, which again is a choreographic poem that just sort of follows rivers and describes all of England's territories. He asks, how can a map and a poem serve the same ideological ends? One answer that he gives to that is that the sensual response, as he puts it, to choreography cultivates a, quote, natural affection, as Camden put it, for the idea of nation. Right? So this is really part of a kind of nationalistic project. We see that in the way that choreographies become a form of embodied geographic knowledge. In Camden's introduction to Britannia, he uses that present tense, the feel of the present, to start off his story. Now I will, by God's assistance, make my perambulation through the provinces or shires of Britain. Now, this is both something that actually happens. He actually walked all over the place to gather information along with a team as part of this. It's also what the reader experiences in flipping through this book. It's kind of like walking around the country. So choreography is a very embodied form of knowledge, but in many ways it's also a very specifically choreographic one. In Drayton's Polyalbion, the rivers, which again organize the narrative, are always described as moving with dance-like motion. For example, in the fifth song, the nimble Cambrian rills dance hey-to-gaze among the hills. In other words, the very geographic unit, the river that structures the narrative, is often framed as a kind of dance. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about if this has given us some sense of how choreography as a genre is a little bit choreographic. I want to turn now to talking about dance specifically and to think about the ways in which forms of choreography in the 17th century, specifically country dancing, have a kind of choreographic function describing a region. how these dances have a kind of regional geographic knowledge embedded in them. And I might strain the connection just a little bit, but that's in the interest of helping us to see a more kind of historically situated sense of what choreography was like in this period. One question that's preoccupying me as we proceed is what representational strategies dance uses when cultivating geographic awareness? And how does dance delineate regional distinctions within and beyond England? So to answer that, I want to look at the genre of country dancing specifically. We might end up with different answers if we looked at other genres of dance, but here's country dancing. So what's country dancing? Well, if you've done a contra dance, as we sometimes call it in America, this is a descendant of that form. It's a highly patterned geometric weaving of bodies. These could be done for everywhere between 6 and up to even 100 or more people. One notation I found was for 100 people and takes about an hour to complete. So some of these were quite massive endeavors. These engravings give you some sense of how spatially preoccupied this genre was. And these existed as theatrical choreographies, but I'm particularly interested in country dance as a social form done by anybody. Now, you may be thinking country dance, okay, that's something rural. Yes, but across the 17th century, it kind of crystallizes into what's really the first sort of properly identifiably English form of social dance that ends up taking the world by storm. How does country dance crystallize as a genre? Well, that's thanks to something that some of you may have heard about, John Playford's collection of country dance notations, the English Dancing Master. I think this shows us the power of print in remediating dance for the ideological project of creating a sense of English nationhood, right? On the one hand, even as this is creating a kind of national discourse in social dance, it would also seem, as a result, to be taking dance out of any location in specific places. To print choreographies would seem to unmoor them from a specific location. But my research is extremely preoccupied with how much this is not so, how much print, if anything, facilitates the reinscription of choreographies at the local level. And as we proceed, I'm particularly interested in the way in which highly regionally located dances end up as a kind of almost popular geographic knowledge, right? Not everybody is looking at a map, not everybody is literate. Some folks are reading these notations and sharing them, but I'm interested in the way in which dance ends up serving as a system for distributing and creating an embodied form of geographic knowledge in the absence of literacy. So, how then is country dance like chorography? Well, there are several answers to this. Dance, you might say, is kind of achronistic, kind of like polyalbion, right? It always has, at least at first glance, the feel of the present, something that's taking place right now. It's obsessed not necessarily with narrative, although that is a possibility, but very often with the geometries of a given space, the room where it's transpiring or the field where it's taking place. Country dance too, is a repository for proper names. This manual includes a list of all the patrons who helped fund it. We'll talk about some titles of dances in just a moment. It really, this collects a lot of names of specific places. This was also a collective, and you could say, following Helgerson, anti-dynastic project. These dances require a community to produce, and indeed they rarely look just as described in these manuals. It's a local community that works together to put together a version of these. And I think fascinatingly and importantly, this is a dancing manual that is funded by non-courtly figures. A lot of earlier dance manuals are often commissioned by a figure of great seniority at court. That's not so here. This too is a kind of embodied vernacular. It's the English dancing master. It's trying to take social dance traditions and make them identifiably, legibly English. Um, and these dances also require specific kinds of places for putting them together. Some could take place just about anywhere. They were small, but many of them required particular kinds of spaces. The great hall of a large estate, perhaps something the size of this room, or a village green where people could gather. In other words, to do many of these country dances, you needed to be at sites of considerable political and social importance, places where people travel to gather and dance together. But I think most fascinatingly is the kind of the way in which country dances, to a degree that I think has been, to my knowledge, entirely misunderstood in histories of the genre, country dance is a profoundly toponymic genre. I just, at random, because I had a copy in front of me, looked at the 1665 edition, and approximately 1/7 of the dances collected in there have explicit toponyms as their titles. Chelsea, Gray's Inn in London, Hyde Park, Hockley. Fascinatingly, for our purposes, 2 dances named for the New Exchange, the New Exchange and the New Exchange. And this was the successor to the Royal Exchange, if you know that. It's another version of the same thing. The New Exchange, think of it basically as like the New York Stock Exchange and Macy's put together. It's a place for finance to transpire and for luxury goods to be sold and traded. And there are other more regional names of other places across England too. I would add that there are lots of other dances with titles that evoke particular places, but these are ones that are overtly toponymic. To talk now a little bit more about the way in which local country dance traditions worked against and also with the totalizing force of printed dance notations, I want to turn to what's really at the heart of my research, which is manuscript and annotation, and what that tells us about how local communities did these dances. My work with editions of The Dancing Master and Apollo's Banquet and other texts shows all of the ways in which local readers were creating variations on these printed versions of country dances. The top right example, by the way, is from a copy of The Dancing Master that I found here at the Newberry on a previous trip when I was here a few years ago, so thank you. And I think this shows us just how much there really is that same dialectic between region and nation that you get with choreography. Right? These are local versions of national dances. And to dive into a concrete example, I want to look at my great scholarly obsession, which is a manuscript that I call the Monkland Miscellany. So a miscellany was a kind of heterogeneous collection of different materials. This one has a family who lived at a small estate called Monkland, just outside Leominster in Herefordshire. This family at Monkland Manor collected in their miscellany family receipts for running the household, deeds and copy holds for who on the estate owned what properties, where their different tenants were, notes from sermons that they heard, songs, poems, and a ton of dance notations that were apparently done as part of this community. You can see, so Monkland is basically, you see this personification of Leominster here at the bottom. Monkland is basically where her feet are. It's a kind of suburb of Leominster. I'd now like to talk about one of the many dances collected in it, a dance called the milking pail. Now, a lot of country dances were explicitly concerned with rural life and kind of described rural life or were named for it in ways that were highly pastoral. Um, and we can see here, if you spent some time comparing these as I have, that there are local variations to how the printed version of this dance transpires. And they get pretty interesting. I'll mention one example in just a moment. But before proceeding, I want to mention another thing about my research that I hope is changing our understanding of this genre in the 17th century. And that's that I've found a fair amount of evidence that country dances were, as we've kind of long known or suspected, actually done not just to instrumental music, but to sung tunes with lyrics. And I think this greatly changes the kind of representational affordances of a country dance. I'm going to give you one example of how the milking pail might have been done at Monkland Manor in the mid-17th century. So one surviving set of lyrics with the tune that pairs with this dance is a ballad by a guy named Martin Parker called The Milkmaid's Life. And if we look at those lyrics, we end up with something pretty strange. So the lyrics to this dance, which again, people might have sung while doing or had someone sing or just remembered while dancing this, right? Say, those lasses nice and strange that keep shops in the Exchange, that's the New Exchange in London, were beset with, quote, the green sickness and changeth their likeness. So the green sickness is basically an early modern feminized version of blue balls. It's extreme horniness that leads to some sort of disorder or obsession. So this ballad that goes with this dance is basically saying women who work in this financial center are overrun with lust and start behaving in really strange ways. It then proceeds to say, and I'm going to try and kind of sing this, although that's not my forte, "'Tis not so, as proof doth show, by them that go in frost and snow to carry the milking pail, to carry the milking pail." It goes on to talk about all kinds of ways in which country women are hardier and more chaste than city women. This becomes particularly interesting when we look at this image from Drayton's Polyalbion, which if you look at the personification of Limster, of which Monkland is an adjunct, you can see that there are a bunch of sheep here. And this woman is spinning some wool because the wool and milk industry from sheep was the local regional industry in this part of Herefordshire. I think that this offers us an opportunity to read the lyrics accompanying this dance as a kind of opportunity for the mimetic representation of husbandry and country labor, right? It overlays the dance, at least with the association, and who knows, right? Part of the fun of doing social dancing is that it's social. You're interacting with other people, you're making things up, you're improvising, you're having fun. So we can picture the ways in which people are imitating, carrying milking pails, doing the very kind of labor around the Monkland estate that we know they were in fact doing because Limster was, as Drayton said, or as he asked, right, "Where lives the man so dull on Britain's furthest shore, to whom did never sound the name of Limster Ore being its wool," right? This Limster was renowned for its wool. And Drayton's Alexandrines I find just horribly annoying, but here they are. So this becomes all the more interesting when we look at the actual choreography here. Because the choreography for Milking Pail has a variation from the printed national version that on the very set of lyrics that describes women at the Exchange being beset with green sickness features a solo moment for the women in the dance. In other words, it offers them an opportunity to embody the idea of, sort of overly sexified or whatever urban women, right? This is a possibility that is embedded in this one local variation, just as the lyrics for the dance afford the possibility of people imitating or at least thinking about the actual sheep milking, cheese production, all that other stuff that they were involved in. This gets even more interesting when we think about the fact that this choreography in this household miscellany is part, it includes, among other things, many receipts for treating illnesses of sheep. So here's an example at the bottom, for to kill the maggots of sheep. It's a it doesn't work, by the way. But this is here's an early modern medical recipe for a veterinary practice of treating sheep. So we can see the way in which the contents of this miscellany within one local community allow this dance that exists in a kind of placeless national choreography to take on profoundly pointed local meanings. In other words, there are ways in which, just like the genre of choreography, these dances end up surveying or describing local terrain and experiences, especially, in this case, the regional industry related to sheep. We might also note that dances were not just done in isolation. Country dances were often done several in an evening. We could picture this dance, the milking pail, with its moment about the exchange, being performed alongside the new exchange or the new exchange, dances that explicitly referenced London and its financial center. In other words, the kind of embodied geographic knowledge that this dance could cultivate for some of its participants at this moment in time allows those dancers to think not only about the production of local industry and its wool, but also the selling and trading of that at London Center, right? It creates a kind of network between the regional industry and a metropolitan center of finance. So to wrap things up, I just want to turn to one more example of how country dance could produce a very different kind of geographic knowledge. And that's by thinking a little bit about what it meant to do some of these dances, perhaps even the New Exchange, not in rural Herefordshire, but in Sinakomoko, or the New World, the colony of Virginia. Here's one of the maps of Virginia that appears in Strachey's History of Travel into Virginia. I just want to include this briefly because it's so fascinating the way you can see Powhatan. It's in the upper portion of this, where the Powhatan Confederacy, the peoples that were pushed out and killed by the English settlers. This is the center, the area of Virginia with which many of those early settlers were most concerned. In representing some of those villages, we can see what I'm fascinated with in Strachey is the way that some of the successive images zoom in on dance and really foreground dance as an sort of organizing factor of civic life. This is a detail of that dance that we see taking place in the Powhatan village, which we get an even larger and more detailed form in a full 2-page illustration. I have a lot to say about this image, but I just wanted to use it as an example of how much dance is connected to what we would call perhaps, or what has often been called, arguably erroneously, a travel log. In many ways, the obsession with local regional description that characterizes choreography is merely translated to what we sometimes call travel logs, making an implicit claim on this territory as belonging to its colonizers, not its indigenous populations. To look a little bit then at how country dancing might have participated in this settler colonial mindset, I want to turn to briefly to Afra Bean's fascinating play, The Widow Ranter, which is basically about a sort of indentured servant who climbs the social ladder and ends up a pretty powerful local figure. It's one of those plays that reminds you why it's a pity that people don't read more beyond Shakespeare, great as he is, because there's such fascinating stories in other plays. But here's a really fascinating stage direction. I will read it as written, printed in Bean's Widow Ranter. Enter a bagpiper playing before a great bowl of punch, carried between two Negroes, a Highlander dancing after it, the widow ranter, led by a bunch of characters, Timorous Crescent, flirt, dolman, and friendly. Following this, I should mention, there is a scene for indigenous peoples dancing. Right? So what fascinates me here is the way in which London ends up becoming a kind of metropole, organizing thought about who is settling in Virginia, as it's being called. This one little stage direction and the scene for indigenous dancing that follows it shows us just how much the London stage was almost cultivating a different, almost theatrum mundi geographic form of imaginative speculation, right? The stage itself ends up through dance, right? And this scene is a very unusual one in the play, through dance showing us all of the peoples who were starting to occupy this territory. Everything from slaves to indigenous people to English settlers to, fascinatingly, Highland Scots, many of them sent over as indentured servants. This is, by the way, to my knowledge, the first representation of Highland dancing specifically on the English stage. So in other words, this ends up becoming, in the dance scene that unfolds in this play, an opportunity to see and intuit all of the different regions of peoples that were traveling to Sanakamoko or the colony of Virginia, allowing the theater through, we don't know too much about what this is like, but Bean was obsessed with country dancing, both personally and in her plays. And I think we can infer that there's some kind of country dancing that follows this for all of these people. We can see in that country dance the way in which an English, what's explicitly coded as an English form of dance, translated through the magic of theater to an imagined colonial territory, ends up mapping the routes of all the different peoples who, by choice or against their will, are being transported to and occupying this new zone, which through country dancing is framed as a kind of region of England. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Seth. We'll move right on to our final presentation, jointly given by Harmony Bench and Kate Elswit. Harmony Bench is Associate Professor of Dance at the Ohio State University. Kate Elswit is Professor of Performance and Technology and Head of Digital Research at the University of London's Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. They will be speaking today about a series of digital projects that they have collaboratively run, including Dunham's Data, Catherine Dunham and Digital Methods for Dance Historical Inquiry, funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council, which won the 2021 ASTR-ATHE Award for Excellence in Digital Scholarship. They are currently at work on a new funded project, Visceral Histories, Visual Arguments, Dance-Based Approaches to Data, as well as a museum commission. They'll be talking today about mapping movement on the move 10 years on. Please welcome Kate and Harmony.
So thank you so much to all of you for being here to the end of the day. Thank you to Jim for the invitation. Thank you to Salma, to Emily, and previously Gabrielle for organizing. Harmony and I are so delighted to be here and to hear this morning's discussion. We come to this topic as dance scholars who've really spent the last decade considering what it means to map movement for the purposes of analysis. So the questions that we are bringing to today are, what can mapping bring to understanding dance's histories? And how might the nature of dance's expertise in moving bodies challenge what and how maps represent? In 2013, we began collaborating toward the proposition that digital methods and digital mapping in particular were well suited to analyze how movement moves across time, space, and bodies. Our initial research was situated in the context of touring dance companies. We wanted to trace dynamic spatial histories of movement, which we did on the map with the aim of exploring dance's transnational entanglements at scale. However, our mapping evolved conceptually toward tracing the interconnections of historical performers across performers, locations, and repertory, or what we call people, places, and pieces. We began to account for the many ways that space and place manifest in dance's circulation, from dance works that are inspired by real and imagined connections to geography, to the cultural knowledge that performers bring into a company and transmit onwards when they leave.
This talk reflects on how our theory of the map has changed over the past 10 years of our collaborative research. And I'm sorry that I'm short, so many of you can't see me over the monitor in front of me, but we're just going with it. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We also just want to give thank yous to our postdocs who joined us along the way and whose names you'll be seeing on the slides as we go along. Antonio Jimenez Mavillard, Tia Monique Uzor, and Nicola Plant. So first, we're going to take the opportunity to look back on some of our earliest thinking about mapping dance, and then we'll turn to our recent project, Dunham's Data, which asks about the questions and problems that make the analysis and visualization of data meaningful for dance historical inquiry through the case study of influential African-American choreographer Katherine Dunham. Dunham's most substantial years of international touring took her to hundreds of cities on every continent but Antarctica. And she was joined by hundreds of international dancers, drummers, and singers, and they performed hundreds of dance numbers that further developed connections to the places they traveled. Through this research, we grapple with visceral approaches to digitally curating, analyzing, and visualizing dance data in order to amplify understandings of dance's histories as transnational, intergenerational, and intercultural. And we'll conclude with our next projects and how they continue to challenge us to think through representing performances flows both on and off the map.
So here are tune maps from our beginning stage of our research. So our starting point was that curating and analyzing spatial data was a way to think about what we are calling movement on the move. So on the left, you have the 1942 Cultural Diplomacy Tour of American Ballet Caravan in South America, plotted on a historical roadmap to better understand how that tour route was chosen. And interestingly, some of those locations never got airports, and so later on, dance companies of equivalent size wouldn't have been traveling through them. And on the right, you have the Denishon Company on tour in 1924 to 28 against a railroad map to demonstrate modern dance as a national presence beyond New York City. So understanding the national and transnational circulation of dance has been an imperative in the field since the 1990s, raising a whole host of questions regarding the cultural politics of representation and exchange. We argued that a better understanding of touring was necessary to account for dance's global nature, and that the scale and distribution required to reflect dynamic spatial histories of movement needed support from digital methods. The scale of our digital analysis, organized as a data set and represented as a map, expanded our capacity to trace real and potential networks of relation toward a broader understanding of how movement moves.
As Priya Srinivasan notes in analyzing the transnational circulation of classical Indian dance, quote, "Dance is embodied and passes body to body, whether we like it or not," close quote. Dance offers a case study of how data can elaborate corporeal practices of cultural transmission in terms of that movement from body to body. Movement moves across and through. Dance repertories move through dancing bodies as performers learn new dances, just as the dancers themselves move through various cultural landscapes, which we talked about earlier, leaving gestures, steps, and choreographies in their wake. And all of these are embedded within infrastructures of mobility, from transportation and communication systems to impresarios and presenting networks. Mapping dance supports the narration of movement in circulation. Mapping dance supports the narration of movement in circulation, not just isolated in moments of contact or encounter, but rather as part of larger dynamic systems. Dance studies, which is our home academic discipline, is particularly well suited for such work because the field is accustomed to the contradiction of bodies acting as agents of movement that are nevertheless subject to social, political, and aesthetic choreographies. Further, we felt that analyzing movement in historical and cross-cultural contexts challenged the digital humanities to grapple with the phenomenon of live bodies, which are not fixed in print or image, but carry, borrow, and share techniques, styles, theories of corporeality and composition, gestures, and ways of being as they travel.
But even as our early work was engaged in an exploratory process that built towards scholarly argumentation, we were still within the convention of putting points and lines on two-dimensional maps. However, there's something unique about curating, analyzing, and visualizing data related to dancing bodies moving through the world. This became the basis for the next phase of our work, Dunham's Data, Catherine Dunham and Digital Methods for Dance Historical Inquiry, which was funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. Acknowledging that existing digital methods weren't made for digital humanities research, were not made for the complexity of embodiment as understood within the field of dance, Dunham's data focuses on the questions and problems that make the analysis of data meaningful for a dance context. In so doing, it contributes to efforts to recenter the body as part of critical trends to humanize data.
Our core case study, Catherine Dunham, was herself deeply interdisciplinary in the creative and critical research practices that fed her artistic work across media, her dance pedagogy, her social justice activism, and her anthropological scholarship. We began this project wanting to work on a choreographer with a rich transnational history who would allow us to explore digital research methods with both depth and rigor, in particular in relation to our big ongoing question of how movement moves. As soon as we visited Dunham's main archive at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, we knew that she was the right person for this project. Dunham was a prolific 20th century dance artist who choreographed and performed in operas, nightclubs, Broadway shows, Hollywood films, as well as modern concert dance. Dunham really set the stage for asking how movement moves because she traveled around the world for decades, and her choreography was also invested in representing the many peoples and places she encountered.
In addition, Dunham was an extraordinary self-archivist. She saves so much material that it's actually possible to do this kind of work, like figuring out where she was nearly every single day for decades. Expanding our previous pilots, we manually curate these data sets for Dunham's data from a large body of undigitized archival print materials, and what you're seeing here is a scroll through one such data set. The core data sets represent Dunham's whereabouts every day for 25 years as she toured internationally between 1937 to 1962. The 327 dancers, drummers, and singers who traveled with her, and the shifting configurations of the nearly 300 repertory entities that they performed. These find meaning and expression through exploratory static and interactive visualizations. Together, they provide new means to understand the relationships between thousands of locations and hundreds of performers and pieces across decades of Dunham's career. We grapple with the dance-based knowledge practices indexed by each data point, the embodied intercultural and intergenerational memories of which Dunham's repertory was composed, and the physical toll of maintaining a transnational career as what Jana Brown calls a journeying Black woman performer over many decades.
Next slide, please. Dunham's data works with the experiential traces that can be extracted from archival print materials rather than, for example, historical films or via contemporary performance. The data sets draw almost entirely from materials that Dunham herself chose to save. Yet every data point requires evaluation, with discrepancies and competing narratives offering further insight into Dunham's history. So here's an example of how we arrive at location data. This is a postcard written by Dunham in 1952, while touring in the south of France. The postcard itself is from Marseille, that's what's depicted on the front, but the post office stamp on the back is dated and located in Nice. And in the text, she says that she is en route to Spain. So from this single archival item, we're able to glean 3 locations ordered sequentially around a single fixed date. Other data sources we turn to include such random things like dry cleaning receipts, payroll books, programs, visa applications, and run notes, including who might have missed their exit or entrance on a particular day.
As we began to use techniques from our previous research to spatialize Dunham's itinerary, we discovered that sequence and duration were important to our analysis. However, flat maps don't always hold time well, and even our early experiment with a space-time aquarium failed as Dunham's travels took her across both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. So what we're showing now is a set of still screen grabs. We'll be showing you a video in a moment from an interactive visualization that Antonio Jimenez Mavillard built. Between 1947 to 1960 alone, Dunham's personal and professional engagements took her to 190 unique cities over 433 trips. So here time is represented as elevation from 1947 in yellow at the base map up to 1960 at the top. And we've accounted for 98% of the days over the 14 years represented here. Spatializing this data while maintaining chronology allows us to see the architecture of Dunham's global travels, including the locations to which she continuously returned. So in terms of the interactive interface you're seeing here, you can look at this architecture from a bird's eye view. Or in just a moment, what we're going to do is engage with the specific locations and connections between them. So if you hover over the pole associated with a given city, a pop-up shows all of the dates during which Dunham was there. And you can also examine individual trips between places. The granularity of day-by-day accumulation at the heart of this globe has become a core logic of this project. How thousands of individual days are both particular in themselves and also come together to form a spatial rendering of Dunham's personal geography and travel.
We also began to take this data off the map in statistical analyses of the locations she traveled to and how long she stayed. The process of manually curating the granular day-by-day data set that underlies these visualizations drew us closer into Dunham's travel as a project of making do, and illuminated the political injustices she faced. As we followed the frequency with which plans were changed at the very last minute, we began to realize how Dunham's transnational circulation was entangled with her pursuit of financial solvency in the face of many obstacles. These obstacles, in turn, propelled Dunham, her performers, and her work into the world in the mid-20th century. So these two diagrams depict 1950 to 1953, and within this time frame, most of Dunham's trips are between 2 nights and just under 2 weeks. This represents a brutal travel itinerary for Dunham and her performers. The box plot at the bottom shows that her median stay length in any one location is only 3 nights. In other words, she was almost constantly on the road, and she talks about this and complains about it to her impresario, asking for changed conditions. We compared Dunham's travel to that of her modern dance contemporaries, and what we noted is that she tends to travel more frequently. She performs in much smaller cities, so not always the big capital cities, but smaller cities along the way, and she stays for much shorter periods of time, as we said, a median of 3 days, 3 nights. These statistics call attention to the interconnections between Dunham's global legacy and the structural racism she faced. We've also been thinking a lot about how these overviews can help to identify other places important to Dunham's history that are not necessarily reflected in the scholarship, and which can direct attention to new audiences and new loci of practice. For example, in the Western US and Canada, where she performs in nightclubs, these are not necessarily accounted for in the scholarship. This also allows us to call attention to lingering issues of high versus low culture, a divide that's common in both dance and other art scholarships, to reconsider Dunham's total body of work. since a third of her repertoire actually never appeared on a concert stage. It was made for nightclubs and films.
A precise catalog of travel is particularly important for a choreographer whose artistic practice is uniquely informed by real and imagined engagements with geographic locations. As a master's student at the University of Chicago, Dunham spent over a decade in the Caribbean, and her active engagement with local ritual dance there is cited as foundational for participant observer anthropological methods. As her career moved more into dance, Dunham used what Veve Clark, Halifu Osumari, and others have called a research to performance method to inform her creative practice. At the same time, her company members also fed into and maintained representations of various cultures, both from their individual experiences and as their international touring brought them collectively into contact with a broad range of rhythms, gestures, and reference. Among Dunham's archival materials, we found visa applications describing how various dancers and drummers would bring authentic knowledge of a particular place into the world Dunham staged. But we also found sign-up sheets for field trips to see indigenous local dance that would have been unfamiliar to all of the performers. And we also know that Dunham created dances to represent places, sometimes decades before traveling there.
One such work that she created prior to her own travel is Brazilian Suite. Parts of this she choreographed before visiting in the 1940s, and this is what we're seeing up on the screen right now. So we think about the images of the world that Dunham represented on stage. Just keep in mind that she is trained as an anthropologist, and so she's engaged in that research to performance method to bring the objects of her research to the stage. But she also imagines things in advance of her having ever traveled to a location. We think about the images of the world that Dunham represented on stage as she toured in terms of how she herself explained it to her audiences. So here's a program on screen from Belfast in 1952, and you can see that the act-length Brazilian Suite is made up a number of dances that each articulate different relationships to Brazil. I'm gonna do my best with Portuguese and apologize profusely. The dance Acarage is framed as a narrative story about a street vendor in Bahia. Choros purports to be a historical play on a 19th century Brazilian quadrille, and Frevo has the most anthropological referent as a study of Carnival in Pernambuco. So these are not, Dunham's own explanations are not necessarily how a local expert would describe these particular dances or understand the movement that appeared on the stage, but that's a conversation for another day. So in the upper left, you see a map that we built based on the geographic inspiration that Dunham cited in programs for her choreography. And then on the bottom right, we have displayed that geographic inspiration data as a bar chart in terms of the works in active repertory year by year, so that you can see which geographic regions were represented in her performances and the shifts in balance over time. So for example, if you look at the bottom green, that is South America, and you can see how the influence of South America really grows throughout the 1950s. But we also know that Dunham's inspiration came from many sources, not only her direct research and experience, but also from films, from books, and of course from other artists.
So here we think about the flows of those artists working together as a dynamic collective over time and space, and how their embodied knowledge supported the creation and transmission of Dunham's diasporic imagination. So for the visualization on the bottom of this slide, we connected our data set on performer check-ins with a data set of additional info that we gathered about Dunham's dancers, drummers, and singers, specifically the passports they carried. So what's conspicuous is that as her international circulation increased, so too did the multinational balance of her company. So most of the company held US passports in 1947 when she first started to tour internationally, and that's in blue where this graph begins. But you can see how that changes with more and more colors coming in. We also put that performer data and the check-in dates together with Dunham's travel itinerary to notice that during or after Dunham appears in a specific country, often new company members of that nationality appear in her employ, bringing culturally specific knowledge with them. And so this is the visualization in the upper left. And in that visualization, the orange bars represent the time Dunham spent in a particular country, and the blue dots indicate when each dancer with that passport joined. So we've often heard stories about Dunham traveling around the world and picking up performers as she went, but we didn't understand how frequently it happened until we looked at them all at once.
As the previous examples show, connections between place are mediated by dance-based knowledge practices. And our question has been how to make visible those negotiations that are indexed by place, but not necessarily anchored to it. This is a dependency tripartite graph we built to connect Dunham's travels, which are the bubbles in the left column, with the places that inspired her repertory, which are the bubbles in the middle column, and the passports that her dancers, drummers, and singers carried. Those are in the right column. All of these bubbles are organized chronologically. The lines between them make visible multi-directional relationships between Dunham's diasporic imagination and the many places she visited, including locations outside of the Afro-Caribbean with which her work is generally associated, as well as how the performers she picked up along the way contributed their culturally specific embodied knowledge to the creation of her repertory. So just to maybe clarify this a little bit, the directionality of the lines indicates kind of a chronology in terms of what comes prior. Did a person carrying that passport come prior to a visit to a location? Did something in the repertory occur prior to the incoming of a performer, etc.? By looking across these multifaceted connections that Dunham herself created and drew between people, places, and pieces, it's not only a question of how Dunham represents diaspora in her choreography, but also how diaspora moved through these works and through the bodies of her performers. So just as a point of comparison, all the way back in 2015, Kate built this interactive map on the right, which used the sequential layering of vectors to represent the way that touring artists made reference to other places as they went along. So you can see between these two images how much our thinking and visual practices of representing affinities to locations have evolved, in particular to hold on to the complexity of both place and connection, and really exploding that notion of connection as not only tethered to place.
So we started out today asking how the nature of dance's expertise might challenge what and how maps represent. Over the past 10 years of mapping movement on the move, we've come to understand that any project of tracing dance's circulation is inextricable from its processes of transmission from body to body. And we've been seeking visual forms that can help us to argue that as well. So on the left here is a flow diagram where we represent the shifting membership in Dunham's company to get at a core of embodied transmission in terms of the individuals who shared time and space together over time. The visualization moves from dark blue for those who joined earlier to light blue for those who joined later, making clear which performers had the most enduring presence and thus carried the most embodied knowledge between generations of performers. And something we're playing with now is that image in the upper right. And this is for a new project, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to envision the total body of knowledge of a company as a stream graph. And so in that image in the upper right, each stream represents a dance artist's presence year by year in the company, which widens the longer they stay. So the height of the total stream at any given moment is formed by the number of dance artists and their tenure with the company. And what really feels meaningful for us in this newest form is how clearly you can see the effect of each artist on the company's total body of knowledge, at the same time as you get the sense for the way that the company exceeds one individual, even its creator.
And we really see these as a different approach into mapping. Again, Seth was talking about mapping how dance maps knowledge, or how the choreography and chorography can accompany each other. And so our kind of visual representation here is also considering a type of mapping knowledge, mapping a knowledge community, mapping an embodied community. So where are we now? Mapping movement on the move 10 years on. The long-standing question for us has been how to center dance in this work and how that changes things in the project of tracing and visualizing movement and movement's traces. Our first phase was trying to represent dynamic spatial histories of dance touring. Our second phase began to ask what kinds of data we needed to analyze circulation and transmission in a manner that felt meaningful for dance history. In other words, not just importing other approaches to analysis and spatialization, but really creating questions that were meaningful for the historical study of dance. Across this research, there's a phrase we've come to, which is visceral data analysis. And for us, visceral data analysis means curating and analyzing data that is sourced from the complexity and thickness of bodies, and continuing to value embodiment, texture, tactility, and bodily experience in data visualization. And now we're moving into a third phase with a new project called Visceral Histories, Visual Arguments, Dance-Based Approaches to Data. And it's very new days for this work, but it's closer to the act of dancing than our previous archival research. And one strand is trying to define what we call a choreographic syntax for data visualization that encompasses both the visual and movement composition, as well as the relationship between a visualization and the person who might be interacting with it.
And so this idea of a choreographic syntax is kind of an unachievable provocation, which started from a question that arose for us with Dunham's data: how to imbue visualizations with a sense of motion that was resonant of the historical experiences that the data was meant to engage. We started to introduce movement in various ways: flow diagrams, force-directed interactive animations. However, in doing so, it really foregrounded for us the difference between a visualization that feels like movement in general and one that feels like specific movement with all of its complexity. As dancers, we know that movement moves through space and time, but space and time are not enough alone to produce meaningful movement. So this proposition for a choreographic syntax denotes an intentional compositional approach that employs patterns reflective of its specific dance and body-based sources, rather than defaulting to conventions of interactive visualization and digital display that have been developed for the information science community. We're suggesting that engaging with both data and dance history through such intentional rather than arbitrary logics not only affect how we understand dance, but also use the visual to reconfigure how we might imagine past and present movement. Data.
Right. Movement data.
That
Yeah.
was an important word.
So thank you for coming with us on this 10-year journey across time. We're going to, as Jim mentioned at the top, we're going to transition into Q&A before we come back for a movement workshop, but especially since the images are not quite as crisp as we would have hoped, I'll just mention that we have postcards for the project. I'll just mention that we have postcards for the project. Wow, it's nice to see you. Postcards for the project over here on the table, and we also have these. And I encourage you to have a look at our portfolio on dunhamsdata.org. All of our interactive visualizations and our still visualizations are there, as well as more information about Catherine Dunham herself. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for really provocative and interesting presentations. We're not going to turn it over to Leah for a few minutes of question and answer and discussion.
This was wonderful. Thank you for your incredible presentations. And while the questions are coming in, I'll just go ahead and ask my own. And it's interesting because when I was brainstorming with Jim about this session like a year ago, I was like, you need people to talk about dance and how it's mapped and lab notation and like recording of dance. And you guys have not done that, which is so cool. So instead, and I mean, I guess Seth showed a couple of maps of dance. But instead you showed how dance is tied to the land and how dancers are being mapped in space. Very inspirational work. I have different questions for all of you. So for Seth, you hinted that other styles of dance would have been connected to regions and land in different ways, in different choreographies. Can you speak a little bit more about that? And I'm also just wondering how this fits into your larger project. So that's a big question. But and then I'll just get all the questions, and then you can talk. And then for you guys, I just want to hear a little bit more about what we can learn about her choreography by charting her locations. And also, is there evidence that she thought about her audiences in all these different locations and what she was going to be performing for those particular audiences? Are you charting that too? And you did discuss this a little bit in relationship to her interest in the diaspora and everything, but I guess I just want a little bit more. And I also am curious how she herself was mapping dance and recording movement. So, thanks.
Is that, there we go. So I'll mention two brief examples of other genres that might offer somewhat different impressions of geographic or choreographic knowledge. One of those is Morris dancing, right? The thing with bells, extremely complicated genre, but I'll mention that a bunch of sources from the early modern period attest to one of the popular cries that greeted local performances of Morris dancing during holidays and other important occasions. The popular cry that audience members would use, usually in outdoor public spaces, was "Now for our town." Right? In other words, there was a real sense that the local community that was constellated through this performance, right, because it was various neighbors who would take on different roles in a Morris dance, that they were doing something that was highly situated in that town. It was a Morris dance that was a version done there. And then you may know that the monarchs would make progresses across England, and as part of a royal progress, there was almost always a show put on when Elizabeth or somebody else would show up somewhere, and so you often ended up with a situation where court entertainers were interacting with local entertainers and putting on a show, and a performance as part of a Queen's progress when she arrived became an opportunity to show off local dance culture for the kind of tastemakers at court. So those are just two different genres that, if we dived in further, would offer, I think, some really different understandings. In part, I mean, I'm talking about country dance as choreographic in that it's minimizing the presence of the crown in the national imaginary. A royal progress is doing the precise opposite, right? And then I'll just quickly mention that the work on country dance as part of my my book project is actually mostly looking not at geographic forms of thinking, but at the role of country dancing in cultivating a sense of identification with England's first political parties, the Tories and Whigs. A lot of what I do is look at how highly politicized lyrics get attached to different versions of some of these dances, and how that allows people who never used to belong to a political party because they didn't exist start to felt a sense of political belonging during that early, late 17th century period of intense factionalization.
Okay, so there were a couple of things in there in terms of no, we didn't do Laban notation. That's true. Just so that people who are not familiar with that as a vocabulary, it's kind of like a corollary would be like musical scoring, but for movement. So it's a way of documenting, notating, putting in symbolic form the movements of the body. One of the things, I think we did see some notation in Seth's. Laban notation is just one way that people have documented dance, but it is very rooted in a European aesthetic. And so there's an ongoing conversation about how our ability to notate and what we actually see in movement is culturally specific. And so then when we use a notation system, we're documenting our our literal viewpoint, our ideology, the place from which we see, rather than the movement itself or the kind of cultural import of the movement for its practitioners. So I think, you know, the provocation around Laban, I just want to kind of hold that and note that is a place, particularly when you're thinking about computing, it is a place that people go, and we made a very specific choice not to go there for this particular project. In terms of choreography, yeah, as we said, Dunham was an anthropologist, and so she was very aware of the kind of the movement, the musicality, the frameworks that she was incorporating onto the stage, but she also had a creative imagination. And there's this ongoing tension between Catherine Dunham, the creative artist, versus Catherine Dunham, the scholar and anthropologist. Is she, you know, a creator who is entitled to her own her creative labor versus a documentarian who's kind of just importing pre-existing material onto the stage. But in terms of this question of how she herself was mapping dance or recording movement, it's also the case that Dunham's choreography stands apart in the way that it makes visible and is part of a process of itself documented and also participated in physical retentions of movement in the body. And I think that one of the things that dance really asks us to take seriously is that the body actually is an archive, not in a metaphorical way, but in a very literal way. And that's, you know, those cultural retentions are part and parcel of the substance of Dunham's choreography as such.
I would just add with that we showed you a bit of what we've been doing in terms of trying to represent with data what areas of the world she's representing, her geographic imagination, and I think that doesn't always line up with the way she gets described. Similarly to this question of audiences, I think there are really two ways that we've been thinking a lot about audiences in this. So one is that very simple process of spending 3 days somewhere and 3 weeks somewhere else. So Dunham is moving around the world at the time of U.S. State Department funded tours. She is not funded by the U.S. State Department. She is working paycheck to paycheck, and that's something that becomes really, really clear when you're in the data and you've spent a month following her plans for a tour, and suddenly at the last minute that 3-month trajectory disappears. You delete all that data and you start a different thing because the night before something else happened. And I think for us that's been something really important, is understanding that these aren't just places she's disseminating her work in the world. These are the places that are sustaining her, and when they're not, she's not going back or she's leaving. Right, and so for us, that really specific, she's changing all this kind of constant adaptation of the route. It feels really important to us as we think about audiences. The other thing we've been doing, and we didn't really show you much of what we've done with the repertory here, but something else we've been thinking about is every time we see documentation for a performance of a piece, we count it. And so that's clearly not the total number of times pieces are performed, but it begins to give us a proxy. And one of the things we really notice is that there are quite a number of pieces that people who have studied Dunham are very invested in, that are performed very few times, and there are quite a number of pieces that massive audiences saw, that stayed consistently in the repertory for long periods of time, that actually have never really been written about. And so it's this interesting thing of what is Dunham by the way we think, how do we think about the importance of a dance or the canonicity of a dance? This is something we've been talking about. How do you think about the canonicity of a dance by the importance of the choreography versus by the number of audiences that saw it around the world?
Okay, I don't know if we have time. We have one question from the audience, but okay, just one question, again for Kate and Harmony. The idea of a place and the reality of that place are held in Dunham's work. How do you feel that is reflected in map making and its inherent limitations to those who have never traveled to the place, and the privilege of understanding to those who have? It's a big question. I don't know who it's from. Sorry, there's no.
So thank you. I love that question. I'm going to start in waffle, and then Harmony, you can grab if you want. I think something that I feel like we're doing all the time is we have this little dance we're doing where we say, well, there's the data sets and there's the visualizations and there's the essays, and you're never going to get everything from one piece. So we've never expected our visualizations to walk into the world without some context of where the data that underlies them came from, where the essays are. And I think something that I would say our writing more successfully does than our pictures is to complicate some of those things. I think we try to hold it, even not just in terms of the representations of choreography, but also, for example, when we're dealing with passport nationalities, I know this wasn't the best version of it, but if you were to look at that online, of course, clearly, the person who holds a French passport isn't just coming from France at that moment in time, and so we include all of the places all that French passport represents when we say, for example, France, right? And so I think even as we're visualizing, as we do the legends, we're trying to hold on to, I would say, a number of complexities. I think. Do you have more here? I would say something that we also try to hold on to is that the process of going back from her descriptive language in the programs to a map doesn't always work. So there's a piece that gets described as, in Peru, high in the Andes. You can't actually do that on a map. Right, and so I think but that placement feels important to her, and that's where we always, even when we're trying to represent on a map, in fact, the interactive version of that map of geographical representations, in the bottom right corner, we always keep the text from her program. We choose, and we make sure that always stays with it. So I think we're always trying to figure out how do we connect up these pieces, because no one single one's going to do it.
Yeah, just to make that point even clearer, Dunham has a very imaginative geography, right? Like, yes, she's going through places, but how you know a place on the basis of having performed there for 3 nights is very different from a longer duration spent in a location. One of the things that I really heard in the question was about the privilege of being in a place versus seeing it represented on a map. And I think, well, I'll also say it has been a privilege to be in Dunham's archives, to read through her. She wrote so many letters. And to actually kind of see how she is understanding place and see how she understands her privilege vis-a-vis her ability to travel through. And in fact, part of what drew us to her is that she spent so many years outside of the U.S., which she chose to do because of U.S.-based racism, and she felt that she had an easier go of it abroad, and that travel was easier, touring was easier for her. And so she's also kind of acknowledging how she's navigating that landscape. But then in terms of the privilege of being in a location versus accessing it on a map, I think this is also something that we navigate in terms of what we're trying to visualize or trying to represent, as far as Dunham is a very specific knowledge community. So it's one thing to participate as a Dunham dancer and to know the repertoire and to learn the stories, as we were hearing about earlier, and it's a very different thing to have an abstract representation of a relationship. That said, some of what these visualizations do is they make visible connections that were intuited but never had evidence to back them up. And so this is one of those interesting moments where we're providing evidence for things that were known intuitively or things that were part of the oral history, but people didn't have access to the archival documents, or they didn't have access to the tools to bring those to the surface. And so I think that our navigation of privilege kind of exists in a different relationship than place as such, but rather in terms of these knowledge communities and communities of practice.
Okay, wonderful. I think it's time to dance now.